There's a house in Fallbrook, California, where time stopped on a February evening in 2010, not metaphorically, literally, when investigators finally entered the house, days after the family inside had vanished. They found a scene so ordinary, so completely domestic, so utterly normal, that the normalcy itself became the most disturbing thing in the room. On the kitchen counter, half-prepared food, ingredients sitting out, a meal that was being made and was never finished. On the floor near the back door, 2 small bowls, dog bowls, still with food in them. The family's 2 dogs, a German shepherd and a smaller mixed breed, were inside the house, confused and hungry, waiting for owners who were not coming back. On the couch, pillows arranged the way pillows get arranged when people are living in a house, not staged for a showing. The comfortable disarray of a real life being lived. On the computer, browser tabs still open, searches still logged, a life mid-sentence. And in the driveway, the family's car. Not gone, still there, which meant that wherever Joseph McStay, his wife Summer, and their 2 young sons, Gianni, 4 years old, and Joseph Jr., 3, had gone, they had not driven themselves there, or they had left in someone else's vehicle, or someone had come to them. The McStay family, a young, healthy, by all accounts happy family living in a comfortable house in Southern California, had simply ceased to exist. Between February 4th, 2010, and the moment investigators walked through that door, Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and little Joseph Jr. had stepped out of their lives and into a mystery that would grip the entire country for the next 4 years. For years of not knowing. For years of theories and searches and dead ends and hope and a gradual, terrible erosion of hope. And then, 4 years later, the discovery that answered some questions and shattered what remained of every heart that had been following this story. This is the McStay family. This is their story. All of it, from the beginning to the devastating end and everything in between. Stay with me. Before the mystery, before the desert, before the 4 years of not knowing, there was a family. Joseph McStay was 32 years old in February 2010, a businessman, an entrepreneur, the kind of person who moved through the world with energy and ideas, and particular restlessness of someone who is always building something, always planning the next thing. He ran a company called Earth-Inspired Products, a business that designed and sold custom water features, indoor fountains, decorative water elements for homes and businesses. It was a niche business, but a growing one, and Joseph was good at it, enthusiastic about it, genuinely invested in making it work. He was also, by every account of people who knew him, a devoted father, the kind of father who got down on the floor and played with his kids, who took them to the park, who was present in the way that matters, not just physically in the house, but actually there, paying attention, engaged. Summer McStay, born Summer Martelli, was 30 years old. She was the organizational center of the family, where Joseph was the energy and the ideas. Summer was the structure and the warmth. She managed the household, helped with the business, and was by all accounts deeply connected to her children. People who knew her described her as the kind of woman who made you feel immediately comfortable, who remembered things about you, who showed up when you needed her. Together they had built something that looked, from the outside and apparently from the inside too, like a genuinely good life. A nice house in Fallbrook, a pleasant, semi-rural community in San Diego County, wine country adjacent, the kind of place where families go to have space and quiet, a business that was growing, 2 small boys who were healthy and happy and adored. Gianni was 4. Joseph Jr., Joey, was 3, 4, and 3 years old. This is the thing that never leaves you when you follow the story. The ages of the boys, 4 and 3, old enough to have personalities, to have favorite foods and preferred stuffed animals, and the particular comic seriousness of small children who had decided they have strong opinions about things, young enough to be entirely, completely dependent on the adults around them to keep them safe. This family, this ordinary, real, imperfect, and loving family, disappeared on February 4th, 2010, and the world would not know what had happened to them for 4 years. Investigators, true crime researchers, and the family's loved ones have gone over the last days of the McStay family's known existence with the kind of forensic attention that only cases like this produce. Because in a disappearance, every detail is potentially the detail that explains everything. And you do not know which one it is until you know. So let us go through what is known about the days leading up to February 4th, 2010. In the days before the disappearance, Joseph McStay was conducting business as normal. He was in contact with clients and suppliers. He had ongoing projects. His emails and phone records show a man who was engaged, working, planning. There is no indication in the business record of someone who was about to walk away from everything. Summer was equally present in her own routines. Phone calls with friends and family. The domestic rhythm of a household with 2 small children. Nothing that, in retrospect, anyone who knew her identified as a signal. The family had been in contact with Joseph's brother Michael McStay in the days before the disappearance. The brothers were close. There was nothing in those conversations that Michael would later identify as alarming, but there were things he would think about differently in the months that followed, turn them over in his mind, wondering if he had missed something. On February 4th, 2010, the last day the McStay family is known to have been in their home, Joseph had a phone call with a business contact in the afternoon. He discussed an upcoming project. He mentioned nothing unusual. He sounded normal. That was the last time anyone spoke to Joseph McStay. After that phone call, nothing. No further calls from Joseph or Summer. No texts. No emails. No activity on any of their accounts. The family's phones, all of them, go dark simultaneously. The silence begins. When a friend became concerned after several days of no contact and went to check on the family, what he found was a house described in the opening of this story. The food on the counter, the dog bowls, the dogs, the car in the driveway, and no McStays. The friend called the police, and the investigation began. In the early days of the investigation, law enforcement made a discovery that would shape the entire narrative for months. Surveillance footage from a border crossing. The San Isidro border crossing, the busiest land border crossing in the Western Hemisphere, connecting San Diego, California, with Tijuana, Mexico, had captured something on February 8, 2010, 4 days after the McStay family was last heard from. A family walking across the border into Mexico. 2 adults, 2 small children. The footage was grainy. Border crossing surveillance in 2010 was not the high-definition technology that exists today. The figures were not clearly identifiable, but investigators and, crucially, the media latched onto this footage as evidence that the McStay family had gone to Mexico voluntarily. This interpretation changed everything about the early investigation. If the McStays had walked into Mexico of their own free will, if this was a voluntary disappearance, a family that had chosen to leave their life behind, then the investigation was not a missing persons case. It was effectively not a crime. People are allowed to leave. People are allowed to move to Mexico without telling anyone. It is unusual, certainly. It is hurtful to the family and friends left behind, but it is not illegal. Law enforcement, operating under this theory, reduced the urgency of the investigation significantly. And the theory was not without some supporting evidence beyond the border crossing footage. Joseph McStay had a history of interest in Mexico. He had spent time there. He had discussed, in various conversations, the idea of potentially living in Mexico at some point. His business, water features, custom installations, was a kind of work that could potentially be conducted from anywhere. Investigators also found, on the McStay family computer, searches related to Mexico. Searches about travel, about living in Mexico, about specific Mexican locations. These searches would become enormously controversial later, as would the question of who had made them, and when, and why. But in the early months of 2010, the dominant theory was the McStay family had gone to Mexico, voluntarily, for reasons of their own. The family and friends of McStays did not believe this, not for a single day. Michael McStay, Joseph's brother, became the public face of the search for the McStay family almost immediately. He did not believe the Mexico theory. He could not believe it. He knew his brother. He knew this family. And he knew that a man who was deeply engaged in his business, who had just had a normal phone call with a client on the day of the disappearance, who had 2 small children and a wife and a house and a life that by all evidence he loved. That man did not walk away from all of it without a word to anyone, not without telling his brother, not without at least taking the dogs. The dogs. This detail haunted Michael and everyone who thought carefully about the case. If you are making a planned move to Mexico, even a spontaneous one, even one made in a rush, you do not leave your dogs behind without arrangements. You do not leave them locked in a house with food in their bowls, and no water and no plan. People who love their dogs, and by all accounts the McStays love their dogs, do not do this. Michael McStay went public. He gave interviews. He created websites. He appeared on television programs dedicated to missing persons cases. He brought the McStay family story to a national audience. He also, in the way of dedicated family members who cannot trust the official investigation to do enough, became an investigator himself. He learned everything he could about the case. He followed leads. He tracked down witnesses. He asked questions that investigators had not asked or had not followed up on. Summer's family, her mother, her relatives, were equally committed and equally convinced that something terrible had happened. The people who knew this family best, who knew them as individuals rather than as the subjects of a missing persons case, were unanimous. The McStays had not chosen to vanish. Something had happened to them, and the something was not good. For years, the McStay family disappeared in February 2010. They were not found until November 2013. 3 years and 9 months of not knowing. What does that do to the people who love the missing? What does it do to Michael McStay, who knew his brother was gone, but did not know where or why or how? What does it do to the grandparents of Gianni and Joey, who held those boys and loved them, and now did not know if they were alive or dead, in Mexico or somewhere else, safe or in danger? The psychology of ambiguous loss, the specific suffering of not knowing what happened to someone you love, is one of the most devastating forms of grief that exists. It is worse in many ways than confirmed death, because confirmed death, as terrible as it is, allows grief to move. It allows mourning. It allows the gradual, agonizing process of acceptance and adjustment. Ambiguous loss does not allow any of that, because you do not know, and because you do not know, your mind, which is trying to protect you, generates hope. And hope, in this context, is its own form of torture, because the hope keeps the wound open, because every day you hope is another day you cannot accept. And the not accepting goes on and on and on while the world continues around you, and other people's lives move forward, and your brother, your son, your grandchildren are somewhere you cannot reach, and you do not know if they're okay. Michael McStay has spoken publicly about these years, about the relentlessness of the question, about the way it colored everything, every morning, every conversation, every moment of ordinary life that felt somehow wrong, because it was ordinary while somewhere out there his brother and his brother's family were not. He continued to search. He continued to speak. He continued to push. And the case continued to draw attention from the true crime community, a growing online network of people who followed cold cases, who gathered information, who generated theories and discussed evidence, and sometimes, occasionally, found things that investigators had missed. The McStay case became one of the most discussed unsolved disappearances in American true crime history. And then in November 2013, a motorcyclist riding through the Mojave Desert made a discovery that changed everything. November 11, 2013, the Mojave Desert, near the small town of Victorville, California. A stretch of desert that is empty and vast and sun-baked, and the kind of place that keeps secrets indefinitely because there is no one around to find them. A motorcyclist is riding through this desert, not looking for anything, just riding. He sees something. In a shallow area of disturbed earth, a spot that might not catch the eye of someone who is not paying attention, but catches his. There is something wrong with the ground. He stops. He looks more carefully. And then he does what you do when you find something that should not be there in the middle of the Mojave Desert. He calls the authorities. Investigators arrive. They begin carefully excavating the disturbed earth. What they find, in 2 separate shallow graves, close to each other in this empty stretch of desert, are human remains. 4 sets of human remains. 2 adults, 2 children. The identification process takes time. DNA analysis, forensic work, The careful, methodical process of establishing beyond any possible doubt who these people were. But investigators already knew the location, the number of victims, the composition of the group. 2 adults and 2 small children pointed in one direction. The McStay family had been found, not in Mexico, not living a new life on a beach somewhere, not safe, in the Mojave Desert, in shallow graves. 3 years and 9 months after they disappeared from their home in Fallbrook, the news broke, and the world that had been following this story, the investigators, the family, the true crime community, Michael McStay and Summer's family, and everyone who had spent 4 years hoping, received the answer to one question. The McStays had not gone to Mexico. They were dead. And now the question, the new, terrible, all-consuming question, was, who did this? The discovery of the bodies transformed the investigation completely. What had been a missing persons case, technically, bureaucratically, a case that had been treated with less urgency than it deserved because of the Mexico theory, became a murder investigation, a quadruple homicide investigation, one of the most significant and high-profile murder cases in California history. The FBI became involved. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department took the lead. Resources that had not been committed to the missing persons case were now committed to the murder investigation. The forensic analysis of the remains was extensive and painstaking. What investigators determined from the remains was deeply disturbing. The manner of death, for Joseph McStay specifically, involved blunt force trauma. He had been struck with a heavy object. The forensic evidence was consistent with the use of a specific type of tool, a sledgehammer, or something very similar. The analysis suggested that Summer and the 2 boys had died in the same manner. This was not an accident. This was not a tragic outcome of a voluntary disappearance gone wrong. This was deliberate, violent murder. A family killed, transported to the desert, and buried in shallow graves that someone had hoped would remain undiscovered indefinitely. The someone had miscalculated, because motorcyclists ride through Mojave Desert, and observant people notice things. And shallow graves in desert soil do not always remain hidden forever. But 3 years and 9 months is a long time, long enough that physical evidence at the scene was significantly degraded, long enough that whatever had been on the surface, tire tracks, footprints, any immediate forensic evidence of how the bodies got there, had been erased by the desert's heat and wind and the simple passage of time. The investigation would have to work with what remained, and what remained, it turned out, was more than the killers had counted on. The investigation moved quickly once the bodies were found. Investigators had always had a person of interest, someone connected to Joseph McStay through business, someone who had known the family, someone whose name had come up in the early investigation and had never quite gone away. His name was Charles Merritt, known to those who knew him as Chase. Merritt was a business associate of Joseph McStay. The 2 men had worked together. Merritt helped with aspects of Joseph's water feature business, working as a kind of contractor or partner on various projects. They had a financial relationship, and like many financial relationships, it had complications. There were disputes about money, disagreements about payments, the specific friction that arises between business partners when the accounting does not match each person's understanding of what is owed and what has been paid. Investigators began examining the relationship between Joseph McStay and Charles Merritt with intense focus. What they found built a case piece by piece. Phone records. The last calls Joseph McStay made before his phone went dark included calls to Merritt. The business relationship, and whatever was happening in it at the time of the disappearance, was the last thing on Joseph McStay's professional mind. Financial records. The investigation into money flowing between McStay and Merritt revealed transactions that investigators found significant, money that moved in ways that suggested motive. And then, crucially, something that connected Merritt not just to the McStay family, but to the specific place where their bodies were found. Cell phone tower data. In the days after the McStay family disappeared, including in the time window when investigators believed the bodies had been transported to the Mojave Desert, Charles Merritt's cell phone had pinged towers in the Victorville area, the same area where the bodies were found. This was not conclusive by itself. Cell phone tower data places a phone in a general area. It does not place a person at a specific location. and Merritt had explanations for his presence in the area. But combined with everything else, the financial disputes, the phone calls, the timeline, it formed the beginning of a case. Investigators continued building it. For years. It took 4 years from the discovery of the bodies for an arrest to be made. November 2014, 1 year after the remains were identified, Charles Merritt was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joey McStay. The arrest was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, the chapter of the legal process, with all its complexity and duration and procedural grinding. But the arrest meant something to Michael McStay and to Summer's family. It meant that after 4 years of not knowing what happened, and then a year of knowing what happened, but not who was responsible, there was finally a name, a face, a specific person who had been identified by law enforcement as the person responsible for the deaths of 4 people who were loved. Charles Merritt maintained his innocence. He would continue to maintain it through years of legal proceedings, through preliminary hearings and motions in the slow, painstaking assembly of the prosecution's case. He said he did not do it. He said the evidence against him was circumstantial, that his presence in the Victorville area was explained by his personal and professional activities there, that the financial disputes with Joseph McStay were normal business disagreements, not motive for murder. He said the prosecution was wrong. The prosecution prepared to prove otherwise, and the stage was set for one of the most extensively watched trials in California true crime history. The trial of Charles Merritt for the murders of the McStay family did not begin until 2019, 9 years after the family disappeared. 9 years. The delays were the product of the American legal system's complexity, motions, hearings, changes of venue, the procedure machinery of a capital case grinding slowly forward. Merritt faced the possibility of the death penalty. The trial, when it finally began, was exhaustive. The prosecution presented a case built on multiple categories of evidence. First, financial motive. Prosecutors presented evidence that Merritt and Joseph McStay had a financial dispute, that Merritt believed he was owed money by McStay, or that he had been accessing McStay's business finances in unauthorized ways that he feared were about to be discovered. The motive, as prosecutors constructed it, was money, the most ancient and common motive for the most ancient and common crime. Second, the cell phone data. Prosecutors presented detailed cell tower evidence placing Merritt's phone in the areas relevant to crime, near the McStay home in the time window of the murders, and near the Victorville Desert location in the time window when the bodies were transported and buried. Third, QuickBooks. This was one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the trial. Investigators found that the McStay family computer, the computer that had been left in the house when the family disappeared, had been accessed remotely using software called Log Me In the days after the disappearance. Someone had logged into the McStay computer from outside the house. Investigators traced that remote access to Charles Merritt. After the family was gone, after they were already dead and in the desert, Merritt had been remotely accessing Joseph McStay's business accounting software, accessing financial records. The prosecution argued this was consistent with someone covering tracks, ensuring that the financial irregularities that might have motivated the murders were obscured. Fourth, a specific piece of physical evidence that investigators found significant, a tool consistent with the murder weapon. Investigators had concluded from forensic analysis that the McStays had been killed with a blunt instrument, likely a sledgehammer. Evidence related to such a tool was part of the prosecution's physical case. Fifth, the totality of the circumstantial picture, the phone calls, the financial relationship, the remote computer access, the cell phone placement, the specific combination of factors that, taken together, the prosecution argued could only point in one direction. Merritt's defense challenged each piece of evidence. The cell tower data was not precise enough to place him at the specific locations. The computer access had an innocent explanation. The financial dispute was not unusual or severe enough to motivate mass murder. The trial was long. It was detailed. It was followed intensely by true crime communities and by the family members who attended in person. Michael McStay sitting in that courtroom day after day, listening to the evidence about what happened to his brother in Summer and those 2 little boys. June 2019. The jury deliberated. The family waited. The true crime community that had followed this case for nearly a decade waited, and the verdict came. Charles Merritt was found guilty. Guilty of the first-degree murders of Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Gianni McStay, and Joseph McStay Jr. 4 counts. 4 people. 4 lives ended in the desert. Guilty. The reaction in the courtroom was a reaction of people who have been waiting, some of them for 9 years, some for longer, for this moment. Michael McStay, who had spent 9 years searching and speaking and pushing and refusing to let this family be forgotten, heard the word guilty and felt something that was not simply relief and not simply satisfaction, and not remotely anything as simple as happiness. It was something more complex and more human than any of those things. The specific feeling of having been right, of having known something and fought for something and been dismissed and doubted, and having ultimately been vindicated in the most terrible possible way, vindicated about a truth that you would have given anything to be wrong about. Summer's family received the verdict through the same complex emotional lens. And then came the penalty phase. The jury was asked to determine whether Charles Merritt should be sentenced to death or to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision that followed was life without parole. Charles Merritt will spend the rest of his life in a California prison. He will not be executed. He will grow old in prison. He will die in prison. And the McStay family, Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joey, will be in the Mojave Desert forever, in the ground where they were placed by the man who killed them. Now let us go back to one of the most debated and most disturbing elements of this entire case, the computer searches. When investigators first examined the McStay family computer in the early days of the investigation, they found searches that seemed to support the Mexico theory, searches about travel to Mexico, searches about Mexican culture and living in Mexico. These searches were used by investigators, by media, by commentators, to build a narrative that the McStay family had voluntarily relocated to Mexico. But as the investigation deepened, questions about those searches became increasingly important. Who made them? When exactly were they made? And, most critically, were they made by a member of the McStay family or by someone else? The timeline of the searches and the timeline of Merritt's remote access to the McStay computer created a deeply troubling possibility. Could someone have planted those searches? Could the Mexico evidence on McStay computer, evidence that had redirected the investigation for years, that had caused law enforcement to treat this as a voluntary disappearance rather than a crime, have been deliberately manufactured to mislead investigators? This is one of the most sinister possible readings of the evidence, and it is a reading that prosecutors did not shy away from. If Charles Merritt killed the McStay family and then remotely accessed their computer, if he planted the searches about Mexico, or if those searches were made by him on their computer to create a false trail, then we are looking not just at quadruple murder, but an elaborate, calculated cover-up. A cover-up that worked. For years, the Mexico theory kept the investigation from treating the disappearance as a murder. It kept resources from being committed. It created a narrative that allowed the real explanation to hide in plain sight. The shallow graves in the Mojave Desert held the McStay family for nearly 4 years. The false narrative on a computer screen held the investigation for almost as long. Let us return to the surveillance footage that started the Mexico theory. The 4 figures walking across the San Isidro border crossing on February 8, 2010. 2 adults, 2 small children. Were they the McStays? This question was debated exhaustively throughout the investigation and through the trial. The prosecution's position, which the jury apparently accepted, was that those figures were not the McStay family, that the McStay family was already dead by February 8th, that the border crossing footage, which had redirected the investigation so significantly, had nothing to do with the McStays. This raises an obvious question. If not the McStays, then who? The border crossing at San Isidro processes tens of thousands of people every day. Families cross constantly. 2 adults and 2 small children crossing into Mexico is not remarkable. It would not be unusual for such a group to appear on surveillance footage on any given day. The footage was grainy. The identification was never definitive. The conclusion that it was the McStays had always been an inference, supported by the computer searches and the timing, but never conclusively established. What the prosecution argued, and what the jury accepted, is that this inference was wrong, that the family in the footage was someone else entirely, that the McStays were already in the Mojave Desert when those figures crossed the border. The defense challenged this. The defense argued that the border crossing footage could represent the McStays, that a voluntary departure to Mexico remained possible, that the prosecution's theory required accepting that an elaborate frame had been constructed, which seemed improbable. The jury disagreed with the defense. But the border crossing footage remains one of the most haunting elements of this case, because somewhere there is a family, 2 adults and 2 young children, who crossed the border at San Isidro on February 8, 2010, and who will never know that their ordinary crossing was for years believed to be evidence of one of the most discussed disappearances in American true crime history. The Mojave Desert kept the McStay family for 3 years and 9 months. In that time, the desert did what deserts do. It preserved some things and destroyed others. It held secrets in the way that vast, empty spaces hold secrets, not through active concealment, but through simple absence of witnesses. The forensic work conducted after the discovery of the remains was extensive and difficult. The condition of the remains after nearly 4 years in desert soil presented significant challenges to investigators working to establish exactly what had happened, exactly how and when the family had died, and exactly how they had been transported there. What investigators were able to establish formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. The manner of death, blunt force trauma, consistent with a heavy striking implement, was established through forensic analysis of the skeletal remains. The specific pattern of injuries was documented and used to argue that the murders had been committed with deliberate force. The shallow depth of the graves, barely deep enough to conceal the remains, suggested either haste or the practical difficulty of digging in desert soil, or both. Someone had buried 4 people in a place they hoped would never be searched. They had not done a thorough job of it. The location itself told investigators something. The Victorville area of the Mojave Desert, the specific region where the grave were found, was an area that Charles Merritt had connections to, not a family connection, not a childhood connection, a practical connection of the kind that leads someone to know a specific stretch of remote desert road where shallow graves might go unnoticed. After the verdict, investigators spoke about the evidence gathered at the burial site, about the careful, painstaking work of establishing what the desert had preserved and what it had destroyed, about the specific challenges of a case where the crime scene had been exposed to the elements for nearly 4 years before it was discovered, about Gianni and Joey, 4 years old and 3 years old, in shallow graves in the Mojave Desert. These are the facts that must not be smoothed over with forensic language or distanced with procedural detail. A 4-year-old child, a 3-year-old child, in the ground, because someone decided that whatever money was at stake, whatever fear or anger or calculation drove that night, those children's lives were an acceptable price. There is no framework that makes that okay. Throughout this story, one figure has been constant: Michael McStay, Joseph's brother, the man who refused. He refused to accept the Mexico theory when everyone else was moving toward it. He refused to let the case go cold. He refused to let the media stop covering it. He refused to let the investigation become one more open file that nobody was actively working. He created a website. He gave interviews. He traveled to Mexico to investigate the theory himself, not because he believed it, but because he needed to disprove it definitively, to push it off the table so that the right theory could take its place. He established a foundation. He worked with advocates. He learned the mechanics of missing persons investigations and cold case investigations and advocacy in ways that no one should have to learn, but that he mastered out of necessity and love. When the bodies were found in November 2013, Michael McStay was one of the first family members to be informed. The moment of being told, the confirmation of what some part of him had feared for 3 years while another part of him refused to stop hoping, is something is described in interviews with a rawness that is difficult to hear. He did not stop, even after the confirmation, even after the grief that the confirmation made possible, real grief. Finally, the grief that ambiguous loss had held at bay, Michael continued to push for the investigation, for the arrest, for the prosecution, for the verdict. He sat through the trial every day, listening to the evidence about what had happened to his brother and Summer and those boys. hearing it described in the clinical language of forensic testimony and legal argument, being in the same room as the man accused of doing it. 9 years from the disappearance to the verdict. 9 years. And after the verdict, Michael McStay spoke publicly. He thanked the investigators. He thanked the prosecutors. He thanked the true crime community that had kept the story alive, that kept pressure on, that had never let this family become forgotten. And he spoke about his brother, about Summer, about Gianni and Joey, not as victims, not as case numbers, as people, as the specific, irreplaceable people they were, the brother who had energy and ideas, the sister-in-law who made you feel welcome, the nephews who were 4 and 3 and who had whole lives ahead of them. Michael McStay carried his family through 9 years of uncertainty and horror and grief and advocacy and found himself, at the end of it, still standing. That is its own kind of extraordinary. The McStay family case became one of the most intensely followed true crime cases in the internet era. Forums, subreddits, Facebook groups, dedicated websites, podcasts, YouTube channels. The online community of true crime followers that had grown enormously in the years after McStay's disappearance found in this case a perfect storm of elements. A sympathetic and photogenic family, a genuinely baffling disappearance, a Mexico theory that seemed both possible and wrong, a years-long absence of resolution that kept the discussion alive and growing. This community produced real contributions to the case. People with investigative skills, former law enforcement, researchers, people who were simply very good at finding information online, dug into publicly available records in ways that generated genuine leads. They tracked down witnesses that official investigators had not prioritized. They built timelines that identified gaps and inconsistencies. They raised questions about the computer searches and the remote access that anticipated what would become central to the prosecution's case. The community kept the McStay family in the public consciousness. During the years when the official investigation had effectively stalled, when the Mexico theory had reduced the urgency and the case was not getting significant investigative resources, the online community kept generating attention, kept the family's photographs circulating, kept the questions alive. This matters. Missing persons cases that stay in the public, I get more resources. They get tips. They get the attention of investigators who might otherwise move on to more current cases. The true crime community's sustained interest in the McStay family was not just intellectual curiosity. It was a form of advocacy. But the community also caused harm. In the years before the arrest, the online discussion about the McStay case generated theories about potential suspects, including theories that pointed at family members. Michael McStay himself was, in some corners of the internet, discussed as a possible person of interest. Summer's family members were subjected to online speculation that was painful and unfair and completely wrong. This is the shadow side of citizen investigation. The same skills and energy and collective intelligence that can keep a case alive and generate real leads can also, when directed without sufficient evidence at individuals who are innocent, cause real damage to real people who are already in pain. The McStay case illustrates both sides of this equation clearly. The community helped, and the community hurt, and the line between the two was not always easy to see in real time. The McStay family case exposed significant failures in how the American justice system handles missing persons cases. Failures that advocates have been pointing to for years, and that the McStay case illustrated with devastating clarity. The first failure, the voluntary departure assumption. When a family disappears and there is any evidence, however thin, however ambiguous, that the departure might have been voluntary, law enforcement has a troubling tendency to treat the case as lower priority. People are allowed to leave. Adults are allowed to make choices that others find strange. And the resources required for a full missing persons investigation are substantial. But the McStay case shows the catastrophic cost of this assumption when it is wrong. The border crossing footage, ambiguous at best, completely unverified as depicting the McStays, was treated as sufficient evidence of voluntary departure to significantly reduce the urgency of the investigation. The family was dead. They were in the desert, and the investigation was treating their disappearance as a lifestyle choice. The second failure, the speed of initial response. In the hours and days immediately following a disappearance, before physical evidence degrades, before witnesses' memories fade, before the trail goes cold. The response is most likely to be productive. The McStay investigation did not achieve the level of urgency in those early days that a quadruple murder deserved. The dogs, the food on the counter, the car in the driveway, these should have been red flags that triggered an immediate, intensive response. They were not treated that way. The third failure, the computer evidence. The searches on the McStay computer, which were used to support the Mexico theory, should have been subjected to much earlier forensic analysis of when they were made and whether they were made by someone in the house or remotely. The technology existed in 2010 to ask these questions. The questions were not prioritized until much later in the investigation. These failures did not cause the McStay family to die. Charles Merritt caused the McStay family to die. But these failures may have meant that the case took longer to be solved, that the killer had more time before the full weight of a murder investigation was directed at him, that the family spent longer in those desert graves before they were found and brought home. These are the systemic failures that advocates, including Michael McStay, have worked to change in the years since. I have been telling this story with the careful, factual, procedural language that a complex case like this requires. But I want to stop now and just say their names. Gianni McStay, 4 years old. Joseph McStay Jr., Joey, 3 years old. 4 and 3. These are not details. These are children, real children who existed in the world with the fullness and the particularity and the complete irreplaceable reality of all children, who had favorites, foods, toys, games, bedtime rituals, who had personalities already forming in the specific way that 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds have personalities, strong opinions about small things, pure joy at the right moment, the absolute trust of small children who have been loved and have no reason yet to distrust. Gianni was old enough to remember things, to have memories that would have stayed with him into adulthood if he had been given an adulthood. He was old enough that people who knew him, grandparents, family friends, the adults who had watched him grow from an infant to a 4-year-old boy, would have specific memories of specific things he said and did that made them laugh or marvel or feel that particular joy that small children generate in the people around them. Joey was 3, still fully in the baby-to-child transition, still working out how the world operated, still at the age where everything is discovery and everything is slightly magical and the adults around you are the entire universe. They were in that car. Wherever they went that night, they went with their parents, who were, in those last hours, the people responsible for keeping them safe and who were themselves unable to prevent what happened. 4 and 3, in the Mojave Desert for 4 years. This is a human reality of this case that no amount of legal proceedings and forensic evidence and courtroom testimony fully captures. 2 little boys who should have grown up, who should be teenagers now, complaining about their parents and figuring out who they are, and making mistakes that teenagers make, and being embarrassing and wonderful and impossible and irreplaceable. They are not teenagers. They are in the Mojave Desert, and they will not grow up. And the man who made that happen is in a California prison for the rest of his life. That is justice of a kind, the only kind available. It is not enough. It is never enough. At the end of this story, at the end of the 9 years from disappearance to verdict, at the end of the forensic work and the trial and the sentencing and the aftermath, what remains? What does the McStay case leave behind? It leaves behind a specific, documented example of how quickly a family can be taken, how the ordinary rhythms of normal life, food on the counter, dogs fed, business calls made, can be interrupted by a single act of violence that erases everything in an instant. It leaves behind the image of Michael McStay, a man who would not give up, who fought for his brother through 9 years of uncertainty and grief and advocacy, and who proved, in the end, that perseverance and love and the refusal to accept silence have power, that they can reach through years of cold investigation and media indifference and systemic failure and pull a case back into the light. It leaves behind the questions it raised about how we treat missing persons, about the voluntary departure assumption, about the early days of investigations, about the computer forensics that were available but not deployed, about the need for better systems, better protocols, better urgency when families disappear under circumstances that do not fit neat categories. It leaves behind a lesson about the internet and the true crime community, about the power of sustained collective attention, and about the dangers of that attention when it is not carefully aimed. And it leaves behind, this is a thing that does not go away, the specific, unresolvable grief of a family erased. Joseph McStay, 32 years old, building a business, devoted to his children, gone. Summer McStay, 30 years old, the warmth at the center of her family, gone. Gianni, 4 years old, gone. Joey, 3 years old, gone. They deserve to grow old. Joseph and Summer deserve to watch their sons become teenagers, and then adults, and then, perhaps, parents themselves. They deserve the ordinary, irreplaceable arc of a life lived to its natural end. That was taken from them by a man who decided that his financial grievance, whatever it was, however he understood it, however he justified it to himself, was worth 4 lives. It was not worth 4 lives. Nothing is worth 4 lives. Nothing is worth Gianni and Joey. The verdict said this. The sentence confirmed it. Charles Merritt will die in prison, having traded whatever he gained from those murders. And what he gained was nothing, ultimately, because the investigation caught up with him, for everything that the McStay family lost. It is not symmetrical. It is not satisfying. It is not the ending anyone wanted for this story, when it began with a family disappearing into California sunshine on a February afternoon. But it is the truth. And in cases like this, in cases where a family is taken, the world spends years not knowing why, and then spends more years trying to understand who, the truth is what justice is made of. Joseph and Summer and Gianni and Joey McStay were real. They were loved. They are not forgotten. And the man who took them from the world will never be free again. That is the ending of this story. It is the only ending available. And for Michael McStay and for Summer's family, and for everyone who carried this case for 9 years and refused to let it go, it has to be enough, because it is all there is. And because the McStay family, the real family, not the mystery, not the case number, not the desert graves, deserves to be remembered as what they were, a family, real and whole and loved, gone too soon, and never forgotten.